My husband Oliver told me, "I married you because you're the boss's daughter," with a smile. I was sick in bed, looking at the scarves and gloves I'd knitted for him tossed aside without care. His words hurt, making me realize I needed to confront him. Oliver and I have been married for 5 years. We don't have kids, but we've been happy together. He's always busy with work, which sometimes leaves me feeling lonely, but he tries to make time for us on his days off, which helps. I met Oliver through my dad, who used to be his boss. Oliver suggested I stay home after we got married, which seemed like a good idea at the time. It gave me time to pursue my hobbies like sewing and knitting. Every winter, I made Oliver scarves and gloves. At first, they weren't very good, but I improved over time. Oliver started saying they were as good as store-bought ones, which made me happy and encouraged me to keep sewing. One day I told Oliver, "Someday, when we have a child, I want us to sew together." He smiled and replied, "Maybe I'll learn when the time comes." I always supported Oliver, took care of the house, and made sure we spent time together on his days off. With his high salary, we seemed to live a privileged life to outsiders. I was content with this life, imagining a quiet future with my kind husband and our child. About 2 years ago, our peaceful life was interrupted. I suddenly felt dizzy and collapsed while waiting for Oliver to come home. He rushed me to the hospital. When I woke up in a hospital bed, I overheard Oliver talking to the doctor. My symptoms were serious and likely something I would have to deal with for life. It wasn't life-threatening immediately, but it could happen again. Given my condition, doctors advised me to stay in the hospital until I recovered somewhat. Seeing my anxiety, Oliver reassured me, "You'll be here for a while, but don't worry. I'll visit whenever I have time off from work. We'll get through this together." His words and his hand in mine eased my worries. With him by my side, I felt everything would be okay, despite not having any real guarantees. True to his promise, Oliver visited me nearly every day after that. He held my hand, checked on me, and brought my favorite sewing tools when I mentioned how boring the hospital days were. We spent time sewing together and chatting about little things that happened each day. Teaching him to sew was surprisingly enjoyable, and it helped pass the time. But after about a year, the regular visits dwindled. Instead of daily, Oliver started showing up only every few weeks. I figured he must be busy with work and continued sewing, planning to give him the finished scarf I was working on when he visited next. The doctor said I'd be discharged by the end of the year, so I also started making gloves to give him. After a long time apart, I poured my emotions into making the gloves for Oliver. But when he finally visited, he looked coldly at the gloves and said, "Are you still making these? It's annoying." He handed me back the scarf I'd made and divorce papers. The scarf, which I'd worked on tirelessly, looked brand new, untouched since I gave it to him. "You've been in the hospital for 2 years now. I heard you're getting discharged soon, but I can't keep taking care of you," he said. "Let's get a divorce." I looked at the divorce papers. Oliver had already signed them. I thought, so this is how it ends. Truthfully, I'd thought about this possibility ever since he stopped visiting regularly. I tried to convince myself he was just busy with work, but I knew the real Oliver wouldn't neglect me like this. If work had gotten in the way, he would have told me. When he stopped coming without explanation, I knew this was coming. That's why I managed to ask calmly why he wanted a divorce. I wasn't trying to hold on to Oliver. In fact, I knew I had probably become a burden to him. If the kind Oliver I knew wanted a divorce, then I guessed I had no choice. But since Oliver had promised we face things together, I was curious why he had changed his mind. When I asked him, still dazed, Oliver replied harshly, "Isn't it obvious? Since I married you, it's been nothing but trouble. I'm tired of those scarves and gloves you give me every year. I only married you because your father's the boss. How am I supposed to handle you getting sick on top of everything?" He laughed at me mockingly, saying he was fed up with dealing with me. It seemed he resented my innocent enjoyment of our life together. Whenever I talked about happiness, love, or loneliness, he seemed to think I was foolish. Who even wears handmade scarves anymore without feeling embarrassed? Getting those things from you is annoying and a hassle. As Oliver spoke, I noticed he was wearing a luxurious scarf that I hadn't given him. It was clearly better quality than the ones I had made. I wondered if he had never used any of my gifts before. Perhaps they had always annoyed him, and I hadn't realized. After I got sick and my father retired, Oliver no longer had to pretend to care about me at work. Having a sick wife became a convenient excuse for him. In the first year, he made a show of visiting me between his work duties. I could imagine my father, before retiring, praising Oliver at work for being a good husband who worked hard while looking after his sick wife. Oliver had crafted this image for himself and was well liked by his colleagues. That's what he wanted, and it seems my value to him was only realized when I fell ill. When I confronted him with these thoughts, Oliver looked surprised and admitted, "Well, it did make things easier at work. Whenever I mentioned you, people were sympathetic and treated me well. If I worked late, I was praised for being dedicated. If I needed a break, I just had to say my wife is, and that was enough." He said this without a hint of regret. He had cleverly used my illness to his advantage in ways I hadn't known. And as for my upcoming promotion, well, they may be idiots, but I owe it to your illness, he added. As I listened with my head bowed, I looked up when he finished speaking. Instead of the man I loved, I saw a cruel grin on his face. I realized this was his true self. Well, if I could be of some use, then that's good. We probably won't see each other again, so take care, I calmly said, returning the divorce papers to him. He took them without a second glance and swiftly left. That marked the end of our marriage, and I silently cried. After some time, I left the hospital and moved back in with my parents. When my father heard what had happened, he was outraged. I never expected him to be like that, he said. But I had already made my peace. I reassured my father and told him I wanted to stay with them. After tidying up the house, my parents understood and encouraged me to do what made me happy. For now, that meant living with them. Before moving back with my parents, I decided to visit our old house. But when we arrived, the front door lock was broken. Perplexed, we rang the doorbell and were met by a stranger. I asked him about it, and he told us he had bought the house a few months ago and was now living there happily with his family. My parents were furious, but I chose not to disturb the new residents and quietly left. Unable to leave it be, I called my husband right away. He casually replied, "Yeah, I sold it while you were in the hospital. Keeping the money as my compensation. It was my house originally, so you can't complain, right?" His nonchalant words made me sigh. I wish he had told me sooner, I thought. From what I learned, the house had been sold about a year ago, around the time he started showing less concern for me. Even if he had planned to divorce me, selling our home without discussing it was shocking. Although we had finalized our divorce by signing the papers, we still needed to discuss dividing our assets after my discharge. We had scheduled a meeting for the following week, but my husband had acted on his own, which was beyond belief. When I calmly confronted my husband over the phone, telling him he didn't understand anything, he seemed puzzled. "What do you mean?" he asked. I replied, "I'll explain next week," and hung up. I smiled at my concerned parents and asked my father for a favor. I shared my plans with him and asked him to get everything ready. "I've already prepared all the necessary documents. There's not much time before our meeting next week, but we'll manage," my father said, with a slightly worried smile. As my father, he probably felt guilty for introducing me to my husband. His anger toward my husband spurred him to do everything possible to help me. I thanked him and looked forward to our meeting day. Just imagining my husband's face made me smile for the first time in a while. With my father's support, I got ready for the meeting. We decided to meet at my parents' house. We sat in a row, my parents and I on one side, and my husband on the other. He must have known my parents were hurt by the divorce, but he seemed indifferent now. He probably felt there was no need to respect my parents anymore. He remained composed, even showing a hint of a smirk. His attitude was disrespectful and arrogant. "I'm the one who's been wronged here, but I don't plan to ask for too much," I said calmly. "The money from selling the house will be enough," my husband replied, trying to appear generous. My father's face turned red with anger, but I gently placed my hand on his to calm him. We knew that in this discussion my husband was the one at a disadvantage, so there was no need for us to get overly upset. "Before we proceed, there's something important to discuss," I continued, and my father handed over a document. It proved that the land under the house my husband sold belonged to my father. "Yes, the house was in your name, that's clear. But the land belongs to my father, and he holds the title," I explained, showing him the document. My husband frowned slightly. "So what? The house was still mine. No one can complain. Do you think this gives you a way to get back at me?" He chuckled as if he found the whole situation absurd. "It's true that legally, selling the house under my husband's name posed no issues, even though the land belongs to my father," I explained further. "However, this creates a significant problem for the family who bought the house. You sold the house, right? But since my father owns the land, you could demand rent from the family living there. Wouldn't that cause trouble?" I questioned. "We're not planning to take that step, but we won't give up our land rights for nothing. In this situation, our plan is to offer the family the opportunity to purchase the land. We won't ask them to leave or charge rent monthly, but it would be problematic if they refuse to buy the land. Originally, my father intended the land as a gift for us to live on, not to be given away freely to strangers. If they refuse, the family who bought the house might even sue you because the deal wasn't as they were led to believe. Imagine their frustration buying their dream home only to find out they have additional expenses." After we confirmed my father's ownership of the land, we went straight to the family who bought the house. When we explained the situation, they were understanding. They agreed that if there were any legal issues, it would be the seller's responsibility, meaning my husband. They mentioned they might sue him if negotiations failed. Seeing my husband's face go pale, I knew he realized the seriousness of the situation. He understood he could face significant financial consequences. In a shaky voice, he asked, "What should I do?" I smiled and replied, The family could buy the land from us to settle everything smoothly. You'll have to cover that cost. Once they own both the house and land, all current issues will be resolved. Since they weren't informed of the land's value when buying the house, they might demand compensation from you. But that's their decision. The problem is, due to its prime location, the land could be worth more than the house. Even if my husband sells all his assets, it might not be enough. In the end, he could be left with nothing. Alternatively, you could buy back the house and pay for the land, along with a relocation fee to the family. This would return both the house and land to your possession. You could then sell them again, possibly making some money. However, after paying the relocation fee, it's unlikely you'd end up with much, I explained. Either way, you're facing losses, I continued. And regarding alimony, your actions have caused me significant mental distress. I intend to seek compensation for that, so keep that in mind. I've come to realize you used me as a pawn for your career ambitions. Now that I know this, I'm repulsed by everything you've done, and I plan to pursue damages for the emotional distress it's caused me. While evidence may be limited and winning uncertain, discussing this matter is crucial given your current situation. Cornered, Oliver may soon face these harsh realities, my father added. Despite being retired, I still have many connections from my career. I've been in touch with former colleagues who have shared your opinions and actions regarding my daughter. You're being looked down upon by everyone, Oliver. With a cheerful smile, my father shared the news, and finally, Oliver understood the gravity of his situation. The status he had built at work, using me and the money from selling the house without my consent, was slipping away. Now let's discuss what happens next, I said, clasping my hands together and smiling. It was a different smile from any Oliver had seen before, brighter since our separation. You must understand that the fate of your assets will be decided today, I continued. Drawn in by my words, Oliver could only manage a forced laugh, tears in his eyes. The negotiations favored me, and Oliver agreed to pay alimony. We also settled that Oliver would compensate for the land where the house stood, which we then explained to the family who bought our house. In the end, everyone benefited except Oliver, who lost everything. The rumors my father started spread through the company, causing Oliver to lose his status and halt his chances for promotion. As the rumors continued, Oliver found himself isolated, and eventually my father informed me that Oliver had resigned. It's tempting to see it all as karma, as gains made through exploitation are fragile. What Oliver thought he had achieved turned out to be fleeting. As for me, I'm living in my parents' home now and teaching sewing classes. My classes aren't packed, but I earn a decent income thanks to local participants like neighborhood women and children. Although I couldn't have children of my own, as I once mentioned to Oliver, I've discovered that sharing my passion brings me genuine happiness.